welcome to the New School. I am Caitlin Morgan, and I'm from the English Language Studies Department at the New School. And along with my colleagues from Oxford University Press, we are so happy to bring you tonight's presentation, The Secret History of Methods with Scott Thornbury. This will be the fourth talk in the Oxford University Press New School ELT Professional Development Series that we have offered. And we have created this series specifically to bring the local ELT community together so that you can connect with each other in a reliable place and space, and so that you can connect with the most current ideas in the field from notable experts like our Scott Thornbury. Scott actually launched this series for us last summer. How many of you were here for last summer's? Good, good. And he's becoming a familiar face around here, I think, for various reasons. One is some of you were at his talk last summer, so thank you very much for staying with us and coming back. But also he teaches in the MA in TESOL for the New School. And in the summer we have a summer intensive, so he's a New York resident with us during the summertime. And so he's becoming a familiar face, and I think that's a good thing for all of us. Because aside from being faculty for us and an award-winning Oxford author, he's also a highly sought-after presenter and plenary speaker on the international conference circuit. He's published many, many award-winning books on English language teaching and language analysis. He regularly writes for popular practitioner journals such as Modern English Teacher and English Teaching Professional. So he teaches, he trains, he writes, he edits, he blogs, he tweets. He does everything ELT, and I think he's one of the most highly engaged and prolific ELT practitioners around. Needless to say, we are very honored to call him principal speaker for our Oxford New School ELT Professional Development Series. On to the secret history of methods. Now, I'm not going to spoil any secrets. That's for Scott's big reveal. But I will say that I'm so pleased that the topic tonight is methods. Of course, methodology is always a relevant topic. It is central to what we do. But in this era of digitalization, where the way in which we take in information and are communicating with each other is radically transforming with technology, it has never been more important to stay vigilant and aware of our principles of language, learning, and teaching that have stood the test of time, and to really stay focused on what makes a method a method. We need to beware of the method, beware of the medium becoming the method. And so I think this is a very timely moment to raise our awareness about methods again. And so, without further ado, the one and only Scott Thornbury.
Thank you, thank you. Thanks very much for those of you who were here last year for coming back, and for my long-suffering students who've already had a fair dose of me this summer. I'm flattered that you've come back for more. You'll recognize little bits of this presentation. As I said, those of you who were on the methods course last month. It's wonderful to meet you. I've met people that I've taught online, but I've never met face-to-face, but I've met them this evening. That's fantastic. It's part of the pleasure of this online program, or the blended program, that there's always surprises in store. I'm also delighted to run into people who are ex-students who are telling me that they've just got jobs in far-flung places like China. Well done, Carolyn. It's wonderful to know that there is a professional outcome to the program, and we're very proud of the program because it is so oriented towards professionalism. It's great to have ex-faculty from the previous summers here, Victoria, lovely to see you, and all of you who have come along. I hope that this evening will give you something to go away with. It was billed as a discussion. And I think that was probably a safeguard in the event that maybe only about half a dozen people turned up. We would just open the wine and discuss. We're not going to be able to have a kind of informal discussion of that nature with these numbers in this place, but there will be opportunities at the end for questions, and then I think hopefully we'll be able to continue over there, those who want to linger on. I'm very happy to talk to you. So, without further ado, then, I would also like to thank the New School and Caitlin for making this possible, but also Oxford University Press for co-hosting the event and providing some books for you to look at, so please do look at them. I'm always in great sympathy for people who work for publishers who have to carry loads of books backwards and forwards to functions, and you will do Karen a great favor if you buy some of her books so she doesn't have to carry them back. My ones in particular. Okay, one of the great joys of my professional life is that I do a lot of traveling. And I am often, I mean, it's not the traveling that I would most like, in the sense that it's often squeezed into a weekend. And I spend a lot of time in conference centers, and a lot of time in hotels, and I don't see half as much as I'd like to of the places I go to. But when I do get a chance to escape from the hotel or from the conference center, where I head is to the part of town which my nose tells me is where I'll find second-hand bookshops. And the reason I do this is because I have a hobby, and that is collecting old methodology books, textbooks, and course books. How sad is that? And some of you who have been to previous presentations will have seen pages from these books. And one of the motivations behind that is because I am endlessly interested in where we've come from, the kind of archaeology, if you like, of methods, of the present methodology. Where does it originate? How has it changed? Who changed it? How is it represented in different parts of the world by different publishers, by different authors? So, for example, earlier this year I was in Malta, which is a lovely island. I recommend it. Fabulous city, Valletta. And sure enough, it took me a while, but I finally found it, the one second-hand bookshop in Valletta, Malta. And there wasn't much, admittedly, left in this book. It had been picked clean by other people who do have the same hobby, no doubt. And it had sort of turned into a gift shop, in fact. But there was a shelf of books moldering from the days when Malta was part of the British Empire, I think. And there was this book, which I bought, called A Basic Way to English. Again, don't you love the design, or lack of? It was not dated, so I'm not sure when it was published, but judging by the style, the graphics, etc., I'd say it was probably 30s or 40s. And I was delighted when I took it back to my hotel room to find that there were sequences like this in the book. Little dialogues. That is your mouth. This is my mouth. My hand is on my knee. Your finger is on your arm. It gets better. I put my foot on your foot. Your finger is on my... Excuse me, your finger is on my nose. I mean, you have to think a little bit hard to imagine a context for this, but... It gets even better. You take your hand off my arm. This is great for, subway language in New York. My finger is on my chin. I take my foot off your head. Your hand is on your knee. You put your finger on your leg, I take my hand. But my question is, why the suits? They could have said this in a gymnasium, wearing trainers, tracksuits, but suits? I mean, this is the Gilbert and George of ELT. But I love this stuff. I mean, apart from its fun value, but the fact that people were using this kind of text to learn English, and probably many of them learned English very successfully, saying things like, your hand is on your knee, or I take my foot off your head. You could turn this into, set it to music and, a rap. So it's this kind of thing. So it gives me great pleasure, I said, but it's also, it's salutary to think that, as I said before, people were learning languages using these kinds of routines, this kind of language. So this is what I do then. I go around, and here's an example of some of the books that I've collected over the years. Again, I love the titles. You would never get a publisher calling a book now Interesting English. Not like exciting English, thrilling English, but interesting English. Or English in English, as opposed to English and French, or English and German. This one is from Romania. I am learning English. This is part 1 of a series. Part 2 is called I'm Still Learning English. So, and I love the design, apart from anything else. I mean, to watch how the way that the books have kind of changed, the graphics of these books, and what they tell us, not only about the aspirations of the students, but also a little bit, they indicate something, I think, they give you a taste of what might be inside the kind of methodology. These are Spanish books, books I've found in, I mean, you know, what date is that? 30s, 40s. I love this one. This is the audio-visual, so we can date by the graphics. It's very sort of 60s. This was kind of like technology, language labs. Look at his little record player down here. And, this one, a classic British textbook design from the 60s. That's the way to English. This one is from Georgia, ex-Soviet Republic. That really zero design. I mean, great font. And this one, again, this is from Spain, from 1930s, mid-30s, published in Barcelona, so it would have been during the Second Spanish Republic, just before the Spanish Civil War. And again, you can see the iconography here of this kind of the socialist look for a business course. And then the titles, I mean, were great. English Made Funny. This one, a German course published in 1939, Laugh and Be Merry. No, I don't know when it was published, but this is the opposite. This is an Argentinian course, Toil and Chat. You know, the two things that involve. And there's a lot of ideology, of course, in the choice of titles and the choice of graphics. We see how, and these books, I mean, this one probably 100 years old, looking at the background, Big Ben, so this sort of symbolic of, not Big Ben, it's the Tower Bridge. I'm saying Big Ben because a book that I've been involved in a consultative role is just being brought out, published by an American publisher, and what do they put on the cover? Big Ben, you know. Those associations still run very deep, the cultural associations of English as this kind of imperialist language, I guess. And look at this one that leaves no doubt as to where its allegiances lie. This one is actually by appointment to Her Majesty the Queen, so this is how she learns English, presumably. The bowler hat, the businessman, these kind of cliched images. And this is a very recent course published in Spain, still using pictures of telephone boxes which have been long reached their sell-by date, though. This is a nice one. This is a record collection of LPs. And again, this time just to balance the iconography, here we get New York, and again, the way that it's presented as being a new tested method that simplifies language study, enables you to learn English quickly and easily. The kind of the publicity spiel could have been written last week. And then, of course, looking into these books, it's interesting to see how classrooms have changed and how they are construed, the role of the teacher and the students. So here is, this is from a course probably at least 80 or 90 years old, a classroom full of boys, the teacher on the dais, and the motto on the wall. It's interesting, this is a picture from a book which was republished 20 or 30 years later with the same text, but with a slightly more modern teacher. But still a man, still wearing a suit. This is from a course book, the Romanian one. I like to tell you, what am I? I am the master. I am not the mistress. I am big. I am a man. You are not big. You are small. And so on. putting the students in their place. This one I love. Here's technology for the first time. Look at the tape recorder. I mean, this is really modern. And look at the text, teacher. I am standing. Am I standing, Dick? Yes, you are. Where am I? You are standing in front of us and so on. Look at the class, how motivated they look, all three of them. And then we have woman teacher, like Audrey Hepburn as teacher. This is... and Sarah Palin as teacher. You often wondered what she did in a former life. Well, there she is. So this can tell us, as I say, a lot about methodology, a lot about how classrooms are construed. I mean, just as a deviation, one of my other interests happens to be food, and it's very interesting to see how food has been dealt with over the years in textbooks. How it is that we've come from something like this in 1970 to the much more attractive food of 2007. So this is from an English course book with a dialogue about food. You can see how unattractive it is, not that different from the cookbooks of the period, and how we've moved into a whole design look that reflects recipe books now as well. When food was first mentioned in course books way back in the 20s, that was always in the context of the family at table. So you get family scenes with lots of numbered food, and occasionally people would venture into a restaurant, as in this case, 1962. I love this sentence. We eat with our mouth. Our mouth. Our collective mouth. I guarantee you'll never find that collocating anywhere else. Our mouth. Our mouth. This is, and then people went shopping for food, and this is from the audiolingual course, so as a basis for dialogues, you get people, but it wasn't until at least the late 70s you actually get people preparing food, and this, I think, reflected a social change. So this is from a course book that I remember well. I taught from in 1979 called Strategies, and here Rod and Paul, probably the first same-sex couple in a course book, are preparing dinner for Barbara and Sue. They're coming around, and what's really interesting about this, apart from the kind of banal dialogue that goes with the preparation of the they abandon the food cooking altogether. Because Barbara says, that's okay, I hate potato salad. I've got some wine, let's have a glass now. What's interesting, though, from a methodological point of view, that this was the first course book that introduced this kind of exercise, the cut-up recipe. I think it's interesting because it was in the context of 1979, the advent of the communicative approach, functional language, the idea that we should be addressing not only authentic text, but the kind of language that students more likely, to need in performing the common functions of daily life. So what you've got here then is a recipe, in this case for Danish potato salad, and of course it's in a jumbled order. You would need to know that. You wouldn't want to go to this book and start cooking the recipe first with, sprinkle with parsley. So the instructions are in the wrong order. Listen to the instructions making Danish potato. And this kind of text type, or this activity type, has endured. So you get it here a few years later with, in this case, again, making a classic British or English dish called, what's it called? Custard trifle. It's a case of cutting up a cake and pour sherry on. I like this instruction. Just on what? Doesn't matter. Just pour it on. And then I like the design feature of the custard splattered over the page. And then, of course, the food got more daring and more international as the years progressed. And so we have here pizza, but the same idea that it's a matching activity with the instruction. You listen and you match with the pictures. And this gradual sort of globalization, if you like, of food, in a sense, matches the globalization of English. We get more recent books still will find recipes for sushi, for tacos, etc. So and I think it's kind of analogous to the way that English has become an international property just as food no longer belongs to the English, thank heavens. And I think that's responsible partly for this change in look in the course books. It reflects a growing internationalism and globalization. So that's just a sideline looking at the way food is treated. As I say, it's a particular interest of mine. What I want to address, though, is going back to the subject of methodology. And the word method itself is very interesting in the way that it's used in these course books. This is from a Spanish course book, and the translation, or método, in Spanish means not only method, but also course book. And so the method, in a sense, is the course book, or the course book is the method. And I found this often being confronted by this question when I've traveled in South America, people saying, you know, what is the latest method? Or what is your method? Or have you written a method? And actually what they really mean is, what is the latest course book? But the ideas are conflated, and it's kind of interesting that the book, in a sense, enshrines or embodies the method. From that same book, you get this illustration. Out of context, that could be ambiguous, but... and it's interesting. So again, I think he's using method here with a capital M to represent the actual course book. The words pleasant and practical do not necessarily always collocate with method. In fact, when you do a search in a corpus to see what are the most common words that do collocate with method, these are they in ascending order, descending order. So new method is one. New is the adjective which most commonly collocates with method, scientific, best, effective. This notion of good, positive. Methods are good, they're scientific, they're systematic. We've inherited that view still. I mean, it hasn't gone away. And I think when it's one of the first questions that many students will ask, or parents of students or sponsors of students will say, what is the method you use in your institution? Is it new, scientific, effective? And this runs counter to a development that's been now dates for 30 or 40 years, which is to discredit the notion of method, to say that methods the method as a concept is kind of associated with a false view of learning or education or teaching or language teaching specifically as being some kind of scientific process that you control in the way that you can control other you work in other scientific disciplines. So what we're experiencing, I think, have experienced is a kind of, as I say, disaffection with the term method. It sounds too scientist. The notion that there's a one-size-fits-all method for all particular contexts simply does not wash with the diversity of contexts in which English or any language is taught or experienced, the variety of students, the variety of teachers, etc. And so we've seen a gradual, in the literature at least, a gradual rejection of the term method and a replacement with more user-friendly terms like approach. So we talk about the communicative approach rather than the communicative method. It doesn't sound quite so prescriptive. Or the writers since the 1980s have been talking about the fact that we need to go beyond methods, that the method is dead or in a post-method period or epoch or paradigm now. And then, even more recently, people have been suggesting, in fact, that there is a conflation of the notion of course book and method, that methods are course books. And if you ask a teacher what their method is, they will point to their course book and say, well, that's what I teach. An Iranian scholar in a recent edition of TESOL Quarterly said, rejected the idea that the concept of method has been replaced by the notion of post-method or whatever, and said we now live in an era of textbook-defined practice. What the majority of teachers teach and how they teach are now determined by textbooks. And I throw that out. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with that. You might want to mull over it, whether you feel that your practice is dictated by your materials or not. I will kind of return to that theme later on. But it's interesting, as a side note, I've just been asked to write a paper on the way that research is impacting on methodology. In other words, the research that's been conducted at one level, at fairly academic level in universities or whatever, on teaching, on language learning, how is it affecting what actually happens in classrooms? And I'm sort of arguing, well, I'm not sure that it is actually, and I think it's not because it's being filtered or blocked even by the fact that what people are doing in classrooms is essentially mediating the materials that wonderful publishers like Oxford University Press are producing. But that's happening independently of the research. I don't know whether you would agree with me or not, but I don't think the research is actually filtering down. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. I'll come back, as I say, I will return to that theme towards the end. So what I'm interested then is, as I say, looking back at the course books, how methodologies have evolved, and assuming that, in a sense, this is the evidence that we have of how people used to teach, trying to reconstruct what language teaching was like in the period that a book like this was printed. This was a recent acquisition I found in a second-hand bookshop in Barcelona, and I particularly like it, not only, the graphics are wonderful, and what it consists of is a whole lot of pictures like this, of very beautifully drawn pictures of scenes. You can see how dated it is, and each thing wonderfully numbered. So that now this is very much within the context of a kind of direct method approach. No translation, just using visuals to teach and to create context for practicing language. But what I found was particularly interesting, and this is published in 1923, and it's part of a series. The same book was reproduced for different markets. So there's a German version. There's even an Esperanto version, apparently. But what I found particularly interesting was what the author had to say about the methodology, or the hints she gave as to how the book could be used. And she said, in oral and written exercises of all kinds, an effort must be made to associate the matter under treatment with the pupil's own observations, to illustrate it from his own experience. And I'm thinking, yeah, that sounds fairly, I can run with that. In other words, although the material looks on the page rather lacking in possibilities for communicative practice, in fact, the author is suggesting that these possibilities do exist if you use the pictures to generate sentences, texts, conversations about the learner's own experience, even if the learner is a male. So I'm thinking this is the kind of stuff that I think is really valuable, because in a sense it gives the lie to the fact that methodology is a constant process of evolution, that rather we're in a state of recycling good ideas endlessly, and this seems to me a good idea. And so what I've done, as well as collecting textbooks, books for students, I've also collected a number of methodology books over the years, and these are some of them. They're actually going back over 100 years. Sometimes they accompany course books, and sometimes they're self-standing methodology books. And I've collected from these, I've sort of sifted some of some of the wisdom, as it were, it seems to me, distilled in these books, which is just as relevant now as it was when they were written as long ago as 1918 in the case of English for Coming Americans, or 1961, I think, the techniques of language teaching. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to have my assistants who have been planted in the audience read out quotations from these books in a loud voice so it can be picked up by but it will be beamed up at the same time. And what I want you to do is think about it and decide whether you agree or disagree. Is this good advice or bad advice? And then on cue, I will ask you to vote. Vote not by the show of hands, but by either booing or cheering. So this is what's called audience participation. Are you ready? Okay, so who's number one? Okay, Peter, in a loud voice.
Find your point of contact in the daily experience of the foreigner and lead him as speedily as possible into touch with the language of daily life.
Yay! Do I hear any boos? No? Okay, unanimous. Thank you, Peter. Very nicely delivered. Yeah, you had the character perfect there. 1918. 1918. Nearly 100 years ago. Number two. John.
Language is not a sterile subject to be confined to the classroom. One or one of two things must be done. Either life must be brought to the classroom, or the class must be taken to life.
1956. Number 3, who's number 3? David.
The student should never be called on to say anything that he has not already learned with imitation of his teacher.
Wonderful. Did I hear a little cheer somewhere? You don't be afraid, this is a discussion. That was number 3. Number 4. Who's number 4? Caroline.
The teacher must really be himself and give himself, talking to real people about real things, and then training his pupils to talk to one another about real things.
A little bit more enthusiasm, please. Yay! Real things. Not your hand is on my knee. Okay, who's number, what are we up to? Number 5. Claire.
Command structure is more easily acquired by reading, speaking, and writing the language than by hearing and studying explanation.
Yeah, any? This one, I've had dissenting voices on this one, so I'm prepared for anything. Well, I think it's interesting that this was said in 1955. I think it's interesting. I mean, because one wouldn't associate the idea of experiential learning, particularly in language learning, and that's what this implies, with that period. When we think 1955 was the heyday of audiolingualism, well, actually, that's not a contradiction, is it? Because audiolingualism didn't tolerate explanation either. But certainly, I find this could well have been written last week in many contexts. Okay, thank you, Caroline. Who was number 6, is it? Alison.
Speaking, do not merely think the words, say them as if they were real. Act them. Language is not a set of words. It is a form of behavior.
Yeah, the word behavior may throw you off a little bit, but I think the sentiment is very much, living the language, experiencing the language. Okay, that was what were you, Alison? You were 6. Number 7? Gabriel.
The language learning is drill, drill, drill.
The key to language learning. So now we have no date, but we can imagine round about when it was written. Okay, so yeah, that one's questionable perhaps. 1953, yes, Hugh.
We teach grammar through conversation and not, as some school teachers attempt, conversation through grammar.
No? This is from Toil and Chat, incidentally, which is, I'm not sure what the toil was, if the grammar was taught through conversation, but that certainly is a modern concept. What number were you, Hugh?
8.
Who's number 9? Paul.
Every teacher of languages should devise ways and methods of getting the new language used as it is in real life. That is, language that performs some useful purpose.
And I think, again, this is particularly interesting. This is 1955, and yet it uses the it uses the rhetoric, if you like, of the communicative approach, which didn't come until 20 years later. The very word purpose, for example, the notion of functionality of language. Yeah. That was number, sorry, Paul, what were you? 9. Number 10, Christopher.
The language must not be allowed to stay imprisoned in the pages of a book.
So elegant. I mean, that should be put on a T-shirt, don't you think? Fridge magnet, that one. So I've lost count again. What were you, Christopher? 10, 11. We've got 2 more. Who's 11? No? Oh, maybe I didn't know. Well, here it is. Let me read it out. Nothing should be spoken before it has been heard. Nothing should be read before it has been spoken. Nothing should be written before it has been read. Control, no, not nice. This was the first book, incidentally, I taught from, which gives a lot away. And that's how we taught. You know, you'll do it in this order, and you will not make mistakes. And finally, we got a 12. Oh, we didn't hand that one out either. Okay, so that one's questionable. And the students should feel that each lesson is their lesson, not the teacher's. In an English class which is well run, the teacher is only a guide. So the point of this is that when you look back over these books, you find a lot of wisdom, as I say, distilled in their pages. So it makes me think that, in fact, there's not a lot of that's new under the sun in terms of methodology. The same good ideas come around and around and around. Yet what's interesting is that often on teacher training programs, the history of methods is taught as if it's been a sort of continual progress from darkness into the light. And it's very much presented in the form of some kind of evolutionary tree. So it's a bit like this, but with the faces mapped on. So in the beginning was Maximilian Berlitz, and he begat Harold Palmer. And Palmer begat, who's the one up there with the glasses? Skinner. And then, of course, Chomsky smote Skinner. And at the very top of the food chain is Henry Widdowson and the communicative approach. But that's how it's often presented, as this kind of evolutionary progress. And I think people are now reassessing that view of methods and methodology and saying, well, actually, it seems to be more like a reconfiguration of the same principles that keep coming around in different forms. And so what I want to do now is very quickly, and forgive me my methods course of last month, because you will have seen some of this before, is talk about what those parameters or dimensions are that are being constantly reconfigured. And so this is the little theoretical bit. It's only 5 minutes. And that's my text, is Alistair Pennycook saying, these changes in methodology have represented different configurations of the same basic option. So it's not an idea I had. It was an idea that Alistair Pennycook, at least he had in 1989. So what are these basic options? It seems to me there are at least 9, if you like, dimensions in which methods situate themselves. In other words, the way that they respond to these polarities, or I wouldn't say they're not polarities so much as clines or spectra, defines the method. And one of these is the nature of language itself. Whether you see language principally, or you describe language initially in terms, or you organize the description of language according to form, or you organize it according to function. And so we've got that major distinction between formal grammars and functional grammars. So by form, I mean the structures. So your course book, for example, is it organized into structures, or is it organized into functions? What is the starting point? Because not to say that a functional course wouldn't also include forms, or a formal course wouldn't teach how these forms are used in real life. But where the starting point is formal, or where the starting point is functional, is a major distinction, both in course books and in grammars, both pedagogical, descriptive. So that's the nature of language. Then the nature of learning is learning the piecemeal building up of information in a kind of analytic sort of fashion, or is it experiential, a more holistic? And that's again a cline which seems to me to define many methods. So experiential learning will be the quotation about learning the grammar through speaking, or learning through conversation, as opposed to studying the grammar, building it up from its elements. What the goals of second language learning are, whether they are accuracy, which was traditionally, certainly when I started teaching, that's why it was so controlled. The goals of learning were accuracy, as opposed to communication, which was the kind of represented by the so-called revolution in the mid-70s, when the communicative approach recalibrated the goals of second language learning. But certainly the communicative approach wasn't the first approach to prioritize communication. And the type of syllabus that's used, whether it's based on the systems, i.e. grammar, phonology, vocabulary, or whether it's skills-based, reading, writing, listening, and whether it's segregated or integrated. By segregated, I mean where the syllabus, the curriculum, is separate from the rest of the curriculum. So you learn French in a French class, and you're in geography in a geography class, math in a math class, or whether they're somehow integrated, that you may learn math through French, or French through math or through history or whatever in a kind of content-based curriculum. And then, what are the roles of the teachers, learners, and materials? Is the emphasis on the learners as thinkers, as puzzle solvers, as intellects, as a kind of a mental or cognitive approach? Or is there more emphasis on them, of the learners as human beings experiencing emotions, fears, pleasures, and so on? And whether the teacher's role is transmissive, transmitting information, as it were, as the fount of knowledge into the empty vessels of the students, or is it more, to use Paulo Freire's terminology, dialogic, where it's a more symmetrical relationship between teachers and learners? Again, that seems to be an important polarity in terms of defining methods. And then finally, the teaching procedures, whether they're based on deductive, giving the rules, and have learners practice them, or learners working out the rules from examples. And whether the medium, whether the learner's target language is used in the classroom, the learner's mother tongue is used in the classroom, or is it only the target language used in the classroom, whether the instruction is done only in the target language, as in the direct method, or whether at least more than one language is used. And again, that seems to be, in fact, a very important defining characteristic of many methods. The direct method set itself up in direct contradistinction to the grammar translation because of that very point. So these, I would say, then are the kind of, as I said, the dimensions of methodology which have fluctuated in the sense if you read them like a kind of spectra that define methods and which recycle, nevertheless, the same basic distinctions. So if you think of something like grammar translation, if you can remember that, and it's still around, again, that's the other fact about methods, that they don't go away. In terms of the way grammar translation is configured, where is it on the spectrum? And I think it's fairly obvious that it's probably on all 9 measures, it's very much to the left-hand side of the diagram. The focus is very much on form, it's an analytic, focus on accuracy, the systems are dealt with separately, it's segregated from the curriculum, it requires a lot of intellectual effort, the translation and the exercises, it involves a lot of transmission, it's deductive, the students are given the rules and they have to apply them, and it's bilingual, because it involves translation. Can you think of a method or methodology which would be on the polar opposite of that? To grammar translation. In other words, that would tick all the boxes on the far right. Yeah, task-based learning, I think, would be a good example of that, which is very experiential for a start, where the focus is on communication and so on. Maybe not necessarily a focus on effective learning, I suppose, but I mean, I'd say yes, very much it's down that end. But it's not impossible to imagine a methodology which kind of zigzagged across these different dimensions. And it's not even impossible to imagine a lesson that one day takes one set of parameters, and then the teacher teaches another lesson the next day which takes another one. In other words, it's possible within one teacher or one institution's methodology that you can fluctuate between those dimensions. But maybe something worth meditating on is where you are situated in these dimensions ideologically, and where your institution is situated, and whether there's a mismatch at all. The question, for example, as to the use of the learner's mother tongue is an endlessly vexed issue that's constantly contested. Maybe in some contexts it's not an issue because it's not possible if you're teaching in multilingual groups. So that's really, that's what I wanted to say about methods. And then to put it to to say that in fact methods don't really exist, rather than what persists are these, in this case 9, there might be more, there might be fewer. Some of them obviously conflate, so you've got cognitive and analytic tend to go together. But to me, they represent the options that are available. So not only is it a way of describing the history of methods, but it also offers a kind of schema for planning new methods, or at least changing one's own methodology by as I say, recalibrating some of these dimensions. So what I want to do finally is to map onto that what's sometimes considered a method, and I deny that it is a method, and it's associated with me, and so I feel a slight responsibility to prove that it's not a method. And what it is, and this I'll have to give a little bit of history and background, those of you who are unfamiliar with this, but it came to life 10 years ago in the form of a website or a discussion group, which brought together a number of teachers around the world who had responded to an article that I'd written in March 2000, which was published in the ITEFL Issues, a magazine published in Britain for language teachers. And in this article, I had argued that we are over-resourced in language classes at the expense of real opportunities for communication. And what I was using was an analogy with a school of filmmaking, which was current at the time, which was located in Scandinavia and was called, forgive the pronunciation, but Dogma. Do you remember those films? It kind of fizzled away. Lars von Trier was the architect of the Dogma film movement. And basically what they were doing, these filmmakers, was they pledged to rehabilitate cinema, movie making, and free it from the constraints that Hollywood was imposing in terms of big budgets, high tech, massive effects, etc. And to restore filmmaking and bring it back into the real world and to establish some basic rules in order to do that. So it was a sort of post-new wave, if you like. And so some of the films some of the rules, if you remember, those of you familiar with things like, all filming should be done on location. So no studio. So any music that you wanted in the film had to be played at the moment of filming. It couldn't be so overlaid. So if you wanted guitar music, you had somebody pick up a guitar and play it in the scene. No props could be brought in. You had to use whatever was in the place where you were filming. If you wanted a flock of chickens, you had to go to where there was a flock of chickens. So they made these films, and if you saw some of them, they're very kind of gritty and in your face, but actually quite memorable. And it did have a sort of it had a minor effect on the history of cinema, which hasn't entirely gone away. So I saw this as being an interesting analogy to where we'd got in language teaching. It seemed to me that we'd become over-resourced, and this was 10 years ago. And it principally emerged out of my own experience as a teacher trainer, where I've seen teachers going into lessons burdened with resources, photocopies, Cuisenaire rods, cassettes. Remember cassettes? And you'd say to them, stuff. And you'd say to them, you know, Betty, it's only a 20-minute lesson. This was it's a teacher training. So yeah, but just in case I run out. I think you're never going to run out. And if you do, maybe you could just talk to them. Shock, horror, no way. But this was a teacher training program, an in-service program in Barcelona, as we started to insist on using fewer materials, we noticed that there was a palpable increase in the amount of communication that seemed to take place. And this seemed to be consistent with the fact that we were meant to be teaching within a communicative paradigm, and yet very little communication was being allowed to happen because there was too much activity, too much material, which was acting as a kind of break or bridge. And this relates back to my other point I made earlier about the fact that the materials are not, in a sense, filtering the research or even blocking the research reaching the classroom. And some of the research is suggesting that learning opportunities are situated in the real communication that emerges in the classroom life. So anyway, so I wrote this article. People got in touch with me. The website was a means of exchanging ideas about how people were doing this kind of stuff around the world. And the question then sort of started to arise, was this a new method? And remember, we went through a phase in the 70s and 80s when people were inventing new methods every week. There was the silent way, and there was TPR, and there was that whole flow to fill the vacuum that had been created by the demise of audiolingualism. And so, you know, here's people are saying, Scott Thornby's just trying to invent a new method. He's a little late. But, and I'm saying, actually, I don't think it is a new method. When you look back at the literature, and the literature I've been showing, it's very much, sorry, I'll move on. It's very much just a reconfiguration of the same principles. That is to say, it's down this end, if you like, of the scale. It's down the task-based end where learning is experiential, it's dialogic, etc., etc. It's the same principles mapped on with a slight tweak in that it kind of suggests that these principles do not necessitate a great deal of materials or technology to be realized. They can be realized through technology and materials, but they don't need to be. And teachers shouldn't feel guilty if they're not using Twitter in the classroom. And so basically, all these principles that you've read out, find your point of contact in the daily experience of the learners, this seems to be very consistent with a dogma approach. That was 1918, if you remember. Either life must be brought to the classroom or the classroom must be taken to life. Again, it's very much consistent with the dogma filmmaking view, and I think consistent with the dogma methodology, if you like, and so on. So these principles then, as I said, that have been retrieved from the collective wisdom of methodologists over the last 100 years are still with us and still worth hanging on. However we dress them up as a method, that's immaterial. It's the principles that are more important than the method. And that first one there captures it very well, I think, that the language must not be allowed to stay imprisoned between the pages of a book. I'm not saying the pages of a book are no good, but the language shouldn't be left there. It needs to be liberated from the book and turned over to the learners. Not to say that course books are bad. In fact, as I've attempted to show, course books are extremely valuable, if nothing else, because of the recipes they have in them. And on that note, I would just like to share an idea, and I'm floating this idea with the publishers, that maybe there's a book to be written of EFL or ELT recipes. So in other words, not go back and retrieve not only the methodology or this marvelous wisdom, but some of the recipes. So this is my proposal to the publishers, that we create an ELT cookbook. And we put into all those wonderful recipes that over the years, and that in a sense have represented the way that methodology is developed. And to do this, I decided to actually cook a couple of the recipes that I've shown you. So this is me cooking the Danish potato salad and the sherry trifle. This is me pouring the sherry on. Or in. And this is me eating the Danish potato salad. And I tell you, it was disgusting. And you know why? There was no flavoring in it, because flavoring is low-frequency vocabulary. So, of course, in an intermediate book, there was no words like gherkin or parsley or mustard or onion. So it's and the sherry trifle doesn't even bear talking about. But I love to have a picnic of ELT luminaries, David Crystal, Jeremy Harmer, Widdowson, to eat some of these course book recipes to launch my new project. And I invite you to join me when the book is published. And on that note, I think it's time to end the presentation and throw it open to any questions. I'll leave you with my... Go on. I was going to say the website is somewhere, but are there any questions? And if there are, then Caitlin has a microphone and will make that available for you.
Oh, quickly. Yeah.
David.
I was going to ask you, so would you say that dogme articulates nothing?
No, I wouldn't say it articulates nothing. I would say it articulates principles that have been around for a very long time. And see, one of the wonderful things about starting that discussion group online was that how it became a resource for people to bring in not just ideas of how they were using a kind of materials-light approach in the classroom, but how they were how they were resourcing the literature of progressive education generally to find other people who were doing similar things or had done similar things. So it became there was a very rich seam of literature referred to in education, including names like Paulo Freire, for example, who had basis lessons on the language that the students produced in his classrooms in Brazil. Sylvia Ashton Warner, the educationist in New Zealand, who threw out the books that had been imported from Britain to teach literacy to these 5-year-olds and substituted materials that were written out of the experience of the children in the classrooms. So no, I would say it's not about nothing, but it's about nothing new. That's the point, yeah.
Thank you. With respect to the research and debate, the ongoing research and debate over new methodologies for teaching, and given that I seem to understand that there's a trend more toward usage-led rather than grammar and structure-led approaches, what is the lag time between the cutting edge of research and debate and the time that ends up in publications?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. That's the one that I've been asked to address, and I think that I think the lag time is enormous. I think, as I said before, because of the hold over most, I mean, apart from if you work in an institution, you have complete freedom to do what you want, but most institutions have curricula, they have syllabi, they have textbooks, and that these are very much self-perpetuating. Because of the enormous investment involved in producing a course book, there's very little innovation, I'm afraid. I mean, I say this at my peril. Karen, I'm sorry. But I mean, it is partly true, and I think publishers will acknowledge this. It's a huge investment to take a risk and say, okay, we're going to do something totally different. That people tend to play safe, and often teachers prefer people to play safe because they themselves don't want to make major changes in their methodology if they're not considered necessary. And I'm not saying you should make major changes in your methodology, but I do think we are a little bit ignorant of some of the research that's going on. But I say that again with a health warning, because I think a lot of the research that's going on is done in very, very local and very non-generalizable contexts. And it would be very dangerous to say just because this bit of research that happened in this laboratory and in this university suggests this, that we should throw out everything and do everything differently. I think that's what we've become wary, just as much as the notion of method has become discredited, the notion of a kind of one-size-fits-all research agenda is also suspect. So there is a lag. The lag is probably healthy because it gives us time to take breath and sort of take a bit of distance between ourselves and the research. But at the same time, there's not just a lag, there's also a blockage, I think, because there is things are clogged by the kind of materials that we're using, which are not susceptible to radical change.
And isn't it also true that the reading lists for the university courses often include works published by the professors who are teaching those courses, who have a great deal to say in determining the reading lists?
Yes. Yes, I think that's true. I say this kind of guiltily. Of course, professors are going to teach their own books. Because, I mean, that's their agenda and that's what they know. But I mean, I think, again, a test of a good book is that it does represent more than one point of view. I remember I wrote a book for another publisher I can't mention called How to Teach Grammar, and I had a chapter in the book on the pros and cons of teaching grammar. And the publisher said to me, well, couldn't you just take out the cons? Or just the pros? The book is How to Teach Grammar, after all. So another person said, no, I mean, a good textbook is going to show both sides of the argument and be representative of all the research that's going on, even if it doesn't necessarily feed into the writer's agenda. But I mean, that is a good point. Victoria, you had a question. Just a second. Oh, a comment.
Writing textbooks. I mean, one of the things that stops the research from going into textbooks is the vast difference in English teachers. There are English teachers in every country, in every situation, with every level of English. And so we have side by side that is still one of the most popular textbooks in the world because
It addresses the diversity
Well,
of...
because teachers can use it. And so all the beautiful, communicative, task-based, it's gorgeous and it fits the research, but 2/3 of the world is, I mean, it's not possible. So that, I'm looking at it from the textbook writer's point of view. It's like, oh my God, you know, you've got, do you write something that people can use, or do you not?
Yes, and point is well made, and I will totally agree. And I think one of the things that comes up again and again in the discussion about dogma is that it is it would be contradictory for it to try and impose its own agenda on context or on teachers for whom this would not work. Large classes, experienced teachers, and that kind of thing. And so it's really more an invitation, though, to people to say, if you're in a position where you could take these kind of risks and you wanted to, you in a sense have permission, because there is a whole tradition there backed up with research into other areas like task-based learning, etc., which would seem to support the fact that this is validated. It is not defaulting on good teaching to say that I'm not going to teach from a course book, but nor is it a sin to teach from a course book. I think the problem becomes more when teachers become over course book dependent when they don't need to be. And this was with our problem on our training program in Barcelona. We had experienced teachers coming to us with years of teaching, and they were still totally dependent on their course book. We said, come on, that's fine when you start, but you can start to free up now because you've got the experience. You can start to take risks. So we were trying to give them the kind of tools whereby they could take those risks and enjoy them and experiment with them. But no, I totally take your point. I learned to teach using course books, but then I got to the point where I needed to free myself of those course books. A couple more questions, and then, yeah.
Okay, I was sitting here racking my brains. I'm trying to understand why the awkward grammar constructions in some of the early ESL and EFL methods textbooks, and so I can't figure out why the awkward grammar constructions. I just wanted to hear your comment.
Well, the examples that I showed you at the beginning, because the focus was so entirely on form, so it didn't really matter what people were saying, as long as the structure was more or less the structure of the day. So you just slotted any kind of words in. And I mean, this has been a long tradition in language teaching materials, that people learned languages using most idiotic sentences. The pen of my aunt is on the table kind of thing. Because it didn't really matter. That's why. And it wasn't until the mid-70s that people said, this is ridiculous. And this whole movement towards authenticity. And then it didn't, but that was all guesswork as to what was authentic or not until corpus linguistics arrived with huge databases of what people really do say, and people could use examples. And we've seen that progression in dictionaries, that dictionaries went from invented examples, often rather silly examples, a long time, and now use authentic, attested examples. So that's the history behind it. But I'm grateful that there was this period because it gives us something to laugh about.
I'm very interested in Howard Gardner's work in multiple intelligences, particularly in the adult education classroom. And I'm just wondering where you might place him on your evolution or in your spectrum. I mean, in particular, the fact that you might assert that, well, for example, this student needs to learn analytically, this student needs to learn by writing, this student needs to learn by speaking, and you might have a classroom where all that's happening at the same time.
Yeah, I don't think you even have to subscribe to multiple intelligence theory to suggest that, yes, on that grid, if you like, those parameters, that there will be some, it's not just a case of methods being situated at one end or the other, but individual students who have predispositions to learning one way or the other. And that's a very binary distinction there between analytic and experiential, but it sort of divides a lot of students. So there are learners who learn better experientially, and there are learners who learn better cognitively and analytically. And then you can elaborate on that basic learner style dichotomy, map onto it the Howard Gardner intelligences, if you want to go that far. I don't think you have to, but you can, certainly. And that suggests that would seem to vindicate the point that I made earlier, that a good teacher is actually fluctuating between those different parameters constantly and making choices, but the choices are in response to what the messages that the teacher's getting from the learners. No, I don't see it as new. Again, I see it as good teaching. And I suppose what I'm saying is that good teaching has always been good teaching and based on sound principles, irrespective of the methods. And I think that's something that's worth bearing in mind, that people learned, even with this, your hand is on my knee kind of method, people did learn. If you factor out, or you factor in to the methods argument, the factors like motivation, then motivation will overcome any amount of ridiculous examples. And motivation will often counter any, even if you've been taught analytically, but you're an experiential learner. If you're motivated enough, you'll turn that analysis into experience, or you'll find opportunities for experiencing language elsewhere. So yeah, good teaching is good. I don't think it's anything new about the theory of multiple intelligence. It's got to have sound practice redressed in a new theory. Anything else? One more, and then have a
predictions for the future. What would you say?
I was asked that recently. How would I predict this dogma movement, which I keep insisting was not meant to be a method or a movement even, but just did take off because a lot of people responded very positively to the idea that they shared the view that we were being constrained by not just the course books, but by the whole machinery of curricula and testing and syllabuses. There's always been this push against the status quo, and a long history which dates from this very institution of people like John Dewey, who were pushing against the status quo, pushed so hard that he started the New School. Well, he didn't start it, but so this is not new, and dogma is not new, and I was asked, but it's 10 years old now, this idea has been going around, and it's created this, as I say, you look at the discussion list, which is still alive and well and receiving postings on a daily basis, and it's clocked up something like 15,000 postings when I last looked. And somebody asked me, it's 10 years in March since I wrote that article, and somebody asked me at a conference in Britain, where do you predict it being in 10 years? And my honest answer is, I don't know. I'm sure it will have morphed into something more appropriate, particularly given the changes in technology. And one of the challenges that's being addressed by people who are sympathetic to the idea of a dogma approach is how do you take that into account, the fact that we live in a completely digitalized age, and there's a whole generation of so-called digital natives coming through who will resist any kind of education which doesn't take that into account. And in fact, the challenge now is to look at the possibilities of technology to see how they can assist in the creation of learning opportunities of the kind that we're talking about, using the learner's language, creating opportunities for real language use, but even if it's mediated at a distance through technology. But this would seem to, and I think that's where things are going. The real challenge now is how to use technology in a way which is consistent with good learning principles and not adopt technology in a kind of mindless, I've just had this argument on Twitter actually recently. Somebody was saying, somebody was posting posting results of a survey that she had conducted, I don't know where, on teachers' uses of Twitter. And so she'd surveyed people and they were responding, and she tweeted, one of the most remarkable, strangest, surprising findings was one teacher who said, I'm not going to use Twitter, I'm perfectly satisfied with the methods I've got. So I tweeted back and said, why is this surprising? This seems to be common sense. Why embrace something like Twitter just because it exists? So, it's this idea that the new is good and the old is bad. And what I've been trying to demonstrate, I think, that there's a lot of good in the old, and we need to be suspicious. Without being reactionary, we need to be suspicious of people who come along, beware geeks bearing gifts.
I'm trying to make sense of what is being called dogma.
Yes.
Dogma. And it sounds to me like it's an attempt to describe the insights that an experienced teacher arrives at, maybe after teaching for 15 years at least, I think. And since, and this is my point of view, I think a lot of research on SLA backs or validates, at least the research on the line of interactionist or interactionism, validates these beliefs that you're sharing with us. So I'm just wondering, what are the implications for teacher education, you know, to you so far?
Yeah, well, a very short answer to that would say I totally agree. I think, I mean, this comes back to the question about research and how research is not impacting, perhaps to the extent that it could, on current practice. And I think one of the things that's happened since dogma first came around, and it's, in a sense, to me, has fed into the theorizing behind dogma is theories of learning which we call generally social cultural, and the idea that all learning is situated, and it's situated within communities of practice. And this would seem to be to offer real support to the view that by creating, the first thing you need to do in any teaching context is create communities of practice with a shared objective, and then bring people in, and they become members of this community through using tools like language. So this has implications, I think, yes, on teacher education, rather than teaching language learning as if it was a purely internal mental cognitive process, which is where we've come from in the last 20 or 30 years, where the obsession has been what goes on in the brain. We should be looking at the wider context and look what goes on in the community, what goes on socially, which either promotes or inhibits language learning. And so a lot of the research that's happening in areas like identity, people like Bonnie Norton in Canada working on identity studies, or people working within the paradigm of social cultural learning, are providing some really interesting insights, which I don't think are really permeating into either methodology or into the materials yet. Although, again, I would insist that good teachers are intuitively aware of the importance of the social context, and will bring those factors in, or will foreground them, because they know that good learning occurs when people are happy with each other. But I think that hasn't really answered your question about teacher education, but I'm sort of, you can see the implications. Anyway, I think it's time. It's 7:30. There are a few more drinks over there. I'm happy to carry on the conversation with you informally, but I think it's time that we got up and moved. So thank you so much for your attention, for coming along tonight. Thank you. Thank you.